Welcome back to the deep dive. You gave us the sources, and wow, this time they're challenging. We got a list of 50, really critical, sometimes taboo questions about the historical reliability of hadith.
That's right. And for anyone who might be less familiar, hadith are the collected sayings, actions, and approvals of the Prophet Muhammad. They're absolutely essential to Islamic law and life, right alongside the Quran.
And our mission today, just to be clear, it's not theological. This is all about historical method.
Exactly. It's an exercise in source criticism.
We're trying to synthesize the big historical critiques, the oral transmission, the time gap, and then present the really sophisticated scholarly defenses that were built up over centuries to deal with those exact problems.
And the core challenge for you, the learner, is just massive. I mean, how do you verify something that was passed down mostly by word of mouth for over 100 years?
Through different people during huge political upheavals.
And then only written down in a systematic way maybe 2 centuries later. That's the challenge that critics like Goldziher and Schock really honed in on.
Okay, let's unpack this. We have to start with the most intuitive critique, the one that just, makes sense to anyone. Memory. The problem of human memory and that huge time gap.
It's the first and biggest hurdle. The critique hits hard right away. We know from science that human memory is, it's fallible. It's reconstructive.
We fill in the gaps without even realizing it.
Precisely. So how can any hadith claim to be a verbatim, word-for-word account when it was recorded 200 years after it was spoken?
It sounds like the world's longest and most important game of telephone.
Right.
You have a chain of 4, 5, maybe 6 people between the prophet and the guy writing it down. How could errors not creep in?
Right.
Or just, little embellishments over time?
And that leads right to the next question. If the Sunnah of the Prophet's way was so vital, why wasn't it written down immediately, with the same urgency as the Quran? That delay itself seems like a red flag to critics.
And they'll point to things like Caliph Umar supposedly being cautious about writing down hadith. They see that as an early sign that, maybe people knew oral memory wasn't a sure thing.
That is definitely the critical interpretation. But this scholarly defense, it pushes back hard. It argues the transmission wasn't just casual chatter, and it wasn't purely oral.
Okay, so if the critics say memory is flawed, end of story, what's the first line of defense?
The first defense is cultural context. The argument is that you can't compare our casual modern memory to what was happening then.
How so?
Pre-Islamic Arabia had what they call a mnemonic culture, a deep professional culture of memorization. Think of poets who could recite thousands of lines of verse, or genealogists who knew family trees going back centuries.
So this wasn't just remembering a story someone told you. This is a trained skill.
A highly trained, highly valued skill. And when you apply that skill to the highest religious duty, preserving the Prophet's words, it becomes an act of intense, motivated preservation. It's the difference between casual memory and, professional religious precision.
I see. And what about the writing part? The idea that nothing was written for 2 centuries?
Well, the second defense is that that's just not true. It wasn't purely oral. Scholars like Azami have shown that many of the Prophet's companions had their own personal written notes.
Personal notes?
Yeah, they were called sakifas, or scrolls. People like Abdullah ibn Amr, Ali ibn Abi Talib, they had written collections of sayings from very, very early on.
So those acted as like a memory aid, a personal backup.
Exactly. There were personal archives that were then passed down and later incorporated into the big systematic collections of al-Bukhari and others. So the gap isn't empty. It's filled with both oral and written transmission happening at the same time.
Okay, and that brings us back to Caliph Umar's caution about writing. How do defenders explain that?
They see it as a temporary safety measure, not a comment on reliability. The main goal was to protect the Quran.
To make sure nothing got mixed up with it.
Right, to ensure its absolute primacy. The fear was that people might confuse the Prophet's words with the divine word. The need for big, systematic books of hadith only came later, as the first generation started to pass away and legal questions got more complex.
So it was more about regulatory caution than a lack of trust in the material itself.
That's the argument.
Okay, but even the classical scholars admit that forgery became a huge problem, so they needed a tool to clean up the data. And this is where it gets really unique. They invented the isnād.
The isnād, yes. The chain of narrators. It's really the heart of the whole system, an audit trail for every single report, which is almost unheard of in other ancient traditions.
Every story has to come with its own bibliography, basically. I heard it from X, who heard it from Y.
All the way back to the Prophet.
Yes.
But this is where the famous critique from Joseph Schott comes in, and it's a powerful one.
He said they were suspicious.
Very. He asked, isn't it a bit convenient that these detailed chains only really start showing up decades after the prophet's death, right when political factions were forming?
His theory was that they were invented backward.
Exactly, that a scholar would have a legal opinion, the matman, and then would just create a perfect-looking chain to give it authority.
That would make the isnād a tool for forgery, not against it.
But the scholarly defense points to the history. Researchers like Mustafa Azami have found evidence of isnads being demanded much earlier than Schott thought, around 40 to 50 years after the Hijra.
Which is right in the middle of the first fitna, the first civil war.
The absolute height of political chaos. And that timing changes everything.
How so?
It reframes the isnad completely. It suggests it wasn't created later to fabricate things. It was developed in a moment of crisis because people were lying.
So it was a defense mechanism.
A proactive tool for crisis management. The turmoil meant you couldn't trust anyone. So the rule became, if you make a claim, you have to show us your sources link by link so we can check your work.
Okay, that makes sense. But checking the chain is just one part. How did they check the people in the chain? This leads to the science of men, jar wa ta'dil.
Yes, the wounding and accrediting. This is where it gets incredibly detailed. For every single narrator in a chain, they evaluated two things, their character adala and their memory dat.
Piety and precision.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And if a narrator failed either test, the hadith was either weakened or thrown out completely.
But the critique comes right back. How can you possibly know the character, let alone the memory precision, of someone who died 100 years before you were born? Isn't that system just based on the biases of the person doing the checking?
It would be if it was just one person's opinion. But the defense is that it was this huge cross-referenced network. A narrator's reputation wasn't decided by one critic in one city.
It was consensus.
A consensus of biographers from rival schools in different regions. The scholars in Kufa were checking the work of the scholars in Medina and so on. They were all holding each other accountable.
And did they do any, practical check?
Oh, absolutely.
Wow.
They did geographic and chronological verification. They'd look at a chain and ask, did narrator A and narrator B actually live at the same time? Were they ever in the same city?
Was it physically possible for them to have met?
Right. If the timeline or the geography didn't line up, the chain was considered broken, or munkadis, and the report was rejected.
And I think what's key here is what you said about dad, about memory. It wasn't just about being a good person.
That's vital. The system prioritized accuracy over piety. You could be the most famous saint of your time, but if you were known to be forgetful or got details mixed up when telling other stories, your hadith were not accepted. The goal was reliable transmission, not just good character.
Okay, so you have a solid chain, the isnādod. You have reliable people in the chain, thanks to jar wa ta'dil. But there's still one more filter, right? The content itself.
Yes, the matan or the text. This is the final safety net. Even if a hadith has a perfect-looking chain of 5-star narrators, it still had to be rejected if the content itself was illogical or contradicted something fundamental.
Such as?
Such as the clear text of the Quran, or a massively transmitted undeniable teaching, the mutawatir sunnah, or just, basic common sense.
So if a hadith with a golden chain said, the prophet ate 3 sons for breakfast, it would be tossed out.
Instantly. The text itself was the last line of defense against absurdity or some kind of theological error that slipped through.
Which brings us to the elephant in the room, which even the classical scholars admitted. Forgery was rampant.
It was a huge problem, especially during the Umayyad and Abbasid periods.
Mm-hmm.
People were just making things up to support their political candidate or their theological sect.
And this leads to what you call the al-Bukhari paradox.
It does. It's a statistic that is just.
Yeah.
It's jarring to hear. Al-Bukhari, maybe the most respected compiler, is said to have sifted through something like 600,000 traditions.
600,000. And how many did he accept into his collection?
Only about 7,000. And many of those are repetitions, so he rejected over 98% of what he examined.
Okay, that sounds terrible. If 98% of the information is polluted, doesn't that just prove the system failed?
That is the obvious external critique. It seems like an indictment. But the traditional scholars, they completely flip the interpretation. They argue the high rejection rate doesn't prove the tradition was corrupt. It proves the methodology was incredibly stringent. That 600,000 number includes duplicates, slight variations, and reports that were rejected because of just one weak link in the chain. The fact that the system was critical enough to find the 7,000 good ones in that giant haystack proves it worked.
It's proof of the quality control.
Exactly. It shows they successfully separated the gold from the dross.
But what about the political angle? The final books were compiled under the Abbasid Empire. How do we know the accepted ones weren't just the ones the state approved of?
The independence of the compilers is the key defense here. Many of the most famous ones, like Imam Ahmad ibn Hanbal, were actually dissidents.
Right, he was famously persecuted by the state.
He was imprisoned and tortured by the Abbasid Caliph for refusing to accept the state-sponsored theology of the time. He was willing to suffer rather than compromise his scholarly judgment for politics.
That's a powerful counter-narrative. It shows these weren't just state functionaries.
And beyond that, if it was all state propaganda, you'd expect the books to be filled with reports that only flatter the rulers. But they're not. They contain hadith that praise Ali, whose family was a rival power center, and even reports that criticize the actions of some ruling figures.
The system had a self-critical element to it.
It did. And you even have scholars like Ibn al-Jawzi, who wrote entire books, huge catalogs, dedicated to just listing all the reports they had identified as forgeries. They were open about the problem.
Okay, last major challenge, the Sunni-Shia split. The fact that there are different collections is often used as the ultimate proof that the whole system was corrupted by sectarian identity.
It's a major point of contention for sure. But it's important to understand where the difference is. It's primarily about the source authority.
What do you mean?
Sunnis see the large body of the Prophet's companions as the main transmitters. Shias, they believe the reliable transmission comes exclusively through the Prophet's family, the al-Bayt, and the infallible imams.
So they trust different initial sources,
Yeah.
but are the methods different?
Not fundamentally. Both traditions use an isnād, a chain, and both have a rigorous science of narrator critique, what they call rihal. So while the starting points in the chains are different, the basic principles of verification are very similar.
And the outcome?
The argument is that the core legal and ethical teachings that come out of both systems are overwhelmingly similar, maybe 80 or 90% overlap, which suggests two independent but parallel preservation systems arrived at a very similar core.
So after all of this whole deep dive, where does this leave us? We started with all these skeptical questions, and we've walked through the layers of historical defense.
I think the final takeaway from the defending scholars is the most important part. They're not claiming absolute metaphysical certainty. That's called yaqin.
Which is impossible for any historical document.
Exactly. The system is human, and it was designed to account for human error. What they do claim is a high degree of probable certainty, a concept called zanganib. Right. And this high probability, achieved through this incredibly complex science of texts and biographies, is considered more than sufficient for establishing law and theology. It's a monumental human effort to mitigate human failure.
So the debate really shifts. It goes from, is this system perfect, which is an impossible standard, to a much better question. Is this the most rigorous historical verification method available for any pre-modern orally transmitted tradition?
That is the question.
Yeah.
You have to compare it to how we analyze Roman histories or biblical texts. And that leaves us with a final provocative thought for you, the listener.
Go on.
If this ancient system auditing chains, cross-checking biographies, verifying sources across rival schools, was all designed centuries ago to fight misinformation, human error, and political bias, what lessons can it offer us today?
In our world.
In our world, where we're just drowning in unverified digital chains, deep fakes, and misinformation every single day. Maybe the tools from the 8th century have something to teach us about how to verify sources in the 21st. Something to think about.